Thank you, Hannah, very much. It is wonderful to see you all. I'm going to see if I can't do this, and I'll feel better this way. As she said, my name is Scott Inman, and I have the privilege and the honor to serve as the minority leader in the Oklahoma House of Representatives for the last 7 years for my merry band of men and women who serve as the conscience of the Oklahoma House of Representatives, sort of standing, tilting at windmills as we do at times, trying to effectuate change that hopefully will benefit all Oklahomans. It's an honor for me to be here with you today. I know my colleague, several of my colleagues in my caucus have been with you already today. And last year at this very luncheon, Representative Young, who's a dear friend of mine and a member of my leadership team, spoke at this very luncheon. And so to be able to sort of follow in his footsteps is something that I don't take lightly. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the invitation, and it truly is an honor to be before the community today. And I've got several things that I want to talk about, but the first is I don't know how many of you guys have been paying attention of what's going on at the state capitol lately, but Oklahoma's in a mess, right? Our state's in a mess, right? Our state's not just in a mess this year, it's been in a mess for the last number of years. For those things that everybody cares about, things like education and health care and public safety and transportation, the state of Oklahoma has been in really a state of crisis. You look at our public schools, for example, and our public school system in Oklahoma has been cut deeper than any other state in the nation, right? Deeper than any other state in the nation in the last about 8 years. And all the while that we've seen cuts to public education, we've seen about 2,000 fewer teachers in the system and about 50,000 new students. So when it comes to public education in Oklahoma, we're in crisis. Higher education, for example, has been cut year after year after year. It is more expensive for us to send our kids to college this year than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Just to put it into an example, it was about 20 years ago that I started at the University of Oklahoma for my undergrad, and then I went to OU Law School. But this past session, the legislature appropriated to the University of Oklahoma $5 million fewer dollars, not adjusted for inflation, $5 million fewer dollars than that we appropriated them in 1999. Right? Let that sink in for a minute. All the new responsibilities, all the new jobs that we want to create as a state through educating a bright and articulate workforce, but yet we've done nothing but cut funding for higher education as well. Then you turn around and you look at health care in Oklahoma. 9 hospitals in rural Oklahoma have filed for bankruptcy in the last 6 years, 9. Other hospitals have gone to outpatient-only facilities like the ones in Frederick down in far southwest Oklahoma. If you want to have a baby in Frederick, Oklahoma, you can't do that anymore. If you want to have surgery, you can't do that, right? Our hospital system alone, statewide, gives away $600 million a year in uncompensated care. Those of you who have businesses, not just in the healthcare community, but those of you who have businesses, imagine if the state mandated that you take care of all the citizens in the state of Oklahoma, which is what hospitals are mandated to do. Right? Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill in 1986 signed EMTALA, which said every person who walks into a hospital in this country will get care regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of insurance, right? Because that's who we as citizens believe that the nation ought to stand for, that we're going to take care of those who may be least among us, right? So it's mandated that hospitals take care of folks. But then when we have an opportunity to bring $900 million a year home from Washington of our federal tax dollars to cover those citizens, because 1 in 5 don't have any health insurance, the state of Oklahoma says no for political reasons, and we watch hospitals file for bankruptcy. That's bad for those who work in the medical community. It's bad for those who need access to it. It's bad for the business community. There are businesses in the state of Oklahoma who, by their own insurance policies, have to be within so many miles of an emergency room. And if a hospital files bankruptcy in rural Oklahoma and they're no longer there, that business has to pick up and move. And so it's bad for business in rural Oklahoma. So education's in crisis and healthcare's in crisis. Public safety's in crisis. Our public safety, our correctional facilities, we lock up everybody in the state of Oklahoma, right? We incarcerate more women per capita than any other state in the nation. And we incarcerate more men per capita than any other state -1, right? You put us all together, we lock up everybody. And I don't believe that's because Oklahomans are worse off as people than any other state. It's just because we've got bad legislators who pass bad laws that put everybody in jail that we're mad at and we're afraid of. But we're at about 110% capacity in our correctional facilities, staffed at about 65 or 70%. On average, in some of our facilities, you've got 1 guard for 150 of some pretty tough folks, right? How we haven't had another uprising in our prison system like we had in McAllister several decades ago is beyond me, but we're close. right? Corrections, our public safety system is in abject crisis. And finally, our transportation system, which had been doing well for the last few years, we've seen them take $50 to $60 million a year out of our roads and bridges funds just to balance the budget. So now it's tougher for our counties to do what they need to do, tougher for our highway system to make sure that we fill the potholes and that we've got good infrastructure. So those, what I call my core 4 areas of government, education, healthcare, public safety, and transportation, have been underfunded year after year after year. But there's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. Some of the folks in charge, some of the folks that you're going to go meet hopefully here in about 45 minutes will give you excuses when you come and talk to them about those things that you care about. They're going to say, well, it's the price of oil or it's some other economic factors. And I want you to understand that when the price of oil was $100 a barrel just a few years ago, and we were all paying $3.50 a gallon for gas, this state cut funding for public education deeper than any other state in the nation. It's a fact. We did. Right? Cut funding for higher ed at the same time. We cut funding for health care at the same time. And you got to go, why is that? Well, because in the last 6 to 8 years, maybe 10 years, the legislature, our legislative leaders, have cut $1.5 billion worth of taxes. $1.5 billion. We only have about a $7 billion budget annually. This year's going to be about $5 billion. We only have about a $7 billion budget. They cut $1.5 billion worth of taxes. They've given away $2 billion worth of tax credits and exemptions to a lot of companies who really don't need it, to be honest with you. We have one of the most generous gross production tax cuts of any major oil and gas producing state in the nation, and we refuse to bring our federal dollars home to cover our uninsured. And I want to highlight real quickly the oil and gas things, because you remember when I said it was $100 a barrel, we were cutting funding for our kids. Not all states were doing that. The state of North Dakota, when the price of oil was $100 a barrel, they increased funding for their public schools by more than any other state in the nation and put $3 billion in their state's rainy day fund, in their state savings account. So that way when the price of oil dropped, they could offset those drops with the savings account, right? That's what North Dakota did when it was $100 a barrel. When it was $100 a barrel, the state of Texas increased their funding for public education and set money aside in their rainy day fund. But Oklahoma, we cut funding deeper than any other state in the nation, and we emptied our rainy day fund during that same time. You got to go, why? Well, because during that time, when the price for oil was $100 a barrel, many of these same companies that operate downtown were drilling in North Dakota, paying an 11% gross production tax. 11%. In Texas, depending upon what county you're in, because they have county level as well as state level gross production taxes, they were paying between 5 to 7 or 8%. And that's the reason they were able to invest in their kids in Texas. But in Oklahoma, it wasn't 11%. It wasn't 7 or 8%. It was 1%. Right? It was 1%. Our state's in crisis. Our citizens are facing crisis after crisis after crisis because of what I believe is failed leadership at 23rd and Lincoln, who've put these things upon our citizens. And you need to know that before you go to the Capitol here in just a few minutes. But I know some of you may be sitting there going, okay, he's like 8 minutes into his speech, and he's not addressed Muslim Day at the Capitol or interfaith dialogue, or, right? All he's done is give me a legislative update, right? Which is true. That's what I did for about 8 minutes. I gave you a legislative update. It's like, does you realize what room he's in? I understand that some of you may be thinking that. But you know, as I prepared my notes for today, thinking, after I was invited to come speak, I thought to myself, well, what should I say? You know, I took a lot of speech and debate classes when I was in junior high and high school in Del City. Matter of fact, did it every year. Did speech and debate and did all kinds of mock trial stuff. We did all kinds. My wife's over here in the corner, and she was in those classes with me. She's my high school sweetheart. So we did all those things together. And what we learned, right, the rule number 1 in speech class is know your audience, right? And that's usually where people stop. But the second thing that you need to understand is you got to know your audience, but you don't want to insult your audience, right? You don't want to get up there and say, well, let me just pander to you, right? So as I kind of thought about what would I talk about today, I thought, you know what I should talk about is the things that we all care about, right? It's Muslim Day at the Capitol, and it's wonderful to celebrate diversity, to celebrate who we are as citizens, come together as Christians and Jews and Muslims and as people who may come from all different backgrounds and faiths. It's incredible to do that, right? But here's what I believe. There are people at the state capitol who love to use the fact that there are Muslims in our community as a way to divide us instead of to unite us, right? That's what they do. They've done it year after year. I've been there almost 11 years now, and I've seen it happen from our friends out in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, who shall remain nameless, right? He does that, right? You'll walk in there. There'll be somebody, I have no doubt in my mind, there will be somebody when you walk into their office here in the next hour or so, who will look at you, whether you're Jewish or Muslim or otherwise, they will look at you and they will prejudge you based upon the way you look or what particular religion you choose to ascribe to. That's what they're going to do. And when they do that, they automatically create a wall. They automatically say, you're different than me. And they miss the most important fact. And that is, if you're in their office, you're an Oklahoman just like they are. Right? You care about public schools just like they do. You care about health care in the city as well as in rural Oklahoma just like they do. You care about driving on good roads and bridges just like they do. You care about having good public safety, keeping the bad guys locked up and having a smart criminal justice system just like they do. But if we allow them to continue to divide us based upon religious or cultural lines, then we allow the state of Oklahoma to continue in the direction that it's in now. Because they will devalue what you believe. You could walk in and say, I think you ought to do this on tax policy, or you ought to do this on health care policy. But if they're allowed to divide us along those lines and not accepting the fact that we're all Oklahomans first, and we all care about each other regardless of our backgrounds, then we can't come together to solve the real problems facing the state of Oklahoma. And so what I've tried to do within my caucus, and it's not very difficult because I've got a wonderful caucus when it comes to many of these issues. But what I've tried to do is when folks from the community approach me or come to my office or approach anybody in my caucus, we don't ask how much money you make. We don't care about the color of your skin, and we certainly don't ask to which God you pray to. Right? We don't do that, right? Because it's immaterial. What we ask is what's your concern? What's your concern for the state of Oklahoma, and how can we find common ground to effectuate that change? The problem that many in the Muslim community face is this. There are too many legislators who don't think that way. There are too many legislators who don't say, well, let me set aside those bonds that are different from us and find those commonalities. They don't do that. And if we as citizens from the Muslim community or those of us who support members of the Muslim community just sit back and wait for them to change, it won't happen. Right? It won't. I believe as long as we want to wait for the gentleman in Sallisaw to come to some sort of enlightenment period, it's just not going to happen if you just sit back and wait, right? So it's incumbent upon you, days like today, the Muslim Day at the Capitol, or at St. Luke's / the Capitol, right? Muslim Day at the Capitol, it's important. You have an enormous role to play to help not just your cause, but to help those from all different faiths and ethnicities and backgrounds and beliefs. I believe, and I don't just believe it, I know it's a fact because I've watched it. People fear what they don't know. It's easy to hate something or someone or some idea if you don't understand it, if you've never met them, if you've never talked to them, right? It's very easy to do that. And oftentimes, and I grew up Catholic in the Bible Belt of the state of Oklahoma, so oftentimes what we find ourselves doing is we sort of cloister together, right? We look around and go, who are my friends? Who thinks like me, or at least who will not throw rocks at me and call me bad names? And so we sort of cloister together. I mean, I've got, I think Anna said 27 Democrats. I wish we only have 26 in the House of Representatives, right? I've got 26 Democrats in the House of Representatives. It'd be very easy for us to just sort of circle the wagons and come together as a group and say, let's just all protect one another, right? But if that's all we do, if we just talk to one another and say, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right, they're wrong, you're right, they're wrong. If that's all we do, right? Then the things that we really want to do, improve education, healthcare, public safety, we'll never get those done. So what we do is we branch out. We meet with Republicans, we meet with independents, we meet with folks who may be politically agnostic, and we do our level best to convince them that our ideas, our vision for the state of Oklahoma, what we care about is the right thing, right? That's what we do. And that's what I want to lay upon you today, is that when you go to the Capitol, it'll help to go meet with your legislators, but it won't solve the problem. What I encourage members of the Muslim community to do, and those members of the community who support the Muslim community, is you've got to continue to integrate, right? You've got to continue to, with the folks with whom you work, or you go to the coffee shop with, you've got to have that dialogue. Don't be afraid to have that dialogue about who you are and what you believe, not in some way to say that they're bad for believing otherwise, but just to say, let me tell you about who I am. Because if you do that, walls will be broken down. And I'm going to make an analogy here, and I hope it's not offensive. I talked to my wife about it beforehand, and I hope it's not offensive because it's not meant to be offensive. I don't want to draw bad parallels or bad corollaries, right? But I will say this, right? I've watched in my 11 years at the state capitol as the legislature has tried to demagogue and demean certain members of our population, in particular, those members of the LGBTQ community, right? I watched them do that. And 11 years ago, there was a lot of hate, and there was a lot of rhetoric, and a lot of legislation aimed at that community. But over time, as folks were more comfortable in who they were and what they believed and were willing to share it with their family and their friends and their coworkers and the people with whom they went to church, all of those things, all of a sudden it became very difficult for legislators to come to the Capitol having built a relationship with somebody from that community and file legislation that would be detrimental to them, right? And so that's what I want to encourage you to do, is to continue to do days like today, but back home in your community, because you're not all from Oklahoma City, back home in your communities, to start to establish those bridges, to establish those lanes of communication. And not just at the coffee shop or at work, but politically as well. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because I don't want to put you all on the spot, but I would love to know how many of you went out and knocked doors for a political candidate in 2016. Right? How many? You can raise your hand if you want to. I appreciate that, right? I know you did, right? Aisha was wearing me out. But that's important because at the end of the day, the folks at the state capitol, they respond to a lot of things, but one of those things they respond to is keeping their seat, right? There's an old adage of you can't save the world if you can't save your seat. So we focus a lot on trying to come back, right? And if members of the Muslim community help knock on doors and help to organize and help get candidates elected, well, when they get to the Capitol, I promise you, people like Cindy Munson and George Young, who've got a wonderful relationship with the Muslim community, when they come to the Capitol, if there's anything bad that's filed, any legislation that's bad that's filed that targets the Muslim community, they will stand up and advocate on your behalf, even though themselves, they're not Muslim, right? And that's because of the relationships that they've built, that you have built with them. And so things are better today. I was talking to Adam a second ago. I remember 3 years ago when you first had the Muslim Day and you had a lot of folks who were upset and angry and they were foaming at the mouth and they called you everything under the sun and you had a lot of protesters there. When I drove over from the Capitol here just a few minutes ago, I think there were 2 people who looked very sad and lonely with a sign sitting out front, right? And I took note of that and I thought, things are changing, right? Things are changing. And they're changing not because the legislators at the state capitol all of a sudden found religion and understood it's probably not good to hate and discriminate against people just based upon how they pray, right? It's not why. There's still a lot of that deep-seated bigotry, to put a point on it, there at the state capitol, no doubt. But it's changing because as members of the Muslim community continue to integrate and demonstrate that at your core, you're an Oklahoman who cares about those same common values of decency and education and health care for everybody. As that's happening, it makes it so much more difficult for the people who wield power at that building to hate you and to discriminate against you. And it's a long, long journey, right? We've all heard the phrase before that the arc of history, right, is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's bending nationally, and it's bending here. And it's because of the efforts of members of the Muslim community and your friends and supporters. I am honored to be here, to be a small part of it, to hopefully encourage you to continue to do what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, I know that your vision for Oklahoma and my vision for Oklahoma, while it may not be 100% on the same page, we all want to see a better place for all of us. You're doing that, and for that I'm eternally grateful. Thank you.
Let's give another round of applause for Representative Inman. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for those wonderful words.